Welcome everyone to this talk titled Tax Policy for Good by Lauren Gilbert. I'm Win, I'm the MC for the session. In this talk, Lauren will talk through some regulatory interventions in the public health and development space that may be best addressed through fiscal policy, from reducing alcohol and tobacco consumption to improving how well cities work. We will then come to a Q&A session. You can submit your questions in the question tab and the live discussion button on the bottom right corner. In about 50 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. I'd first like to introduce our speaker for the session. Lauren works on finding new cost areas for open philanthropy to fund. In 2023, she's also a Tarbell Fellow. During the fellowship, she focuses on public-facing writings on global health and development. Her work has been published in Works in Progress and the Washington Post. And now, please welcome a warm welcome to Lauren.
So, hello, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction, Win. As she said, I'm Lauren Gilbert. I work at Open Philanthropy on the Global Health and Wellbeing Cause Prioritization team. So we consider new possible cause areas that Open Philanthropy might make grants in the future. I work pretty strictly on global health and development, so this talk will also focus on global health and development. If you have questions about AI, I am not the person to ask. I will have no answers to them. So just to preface everything with when I say tax policy for good, I mostly mean that in terms of human health and development in the near term. So a lot of EA charities focus on direct provision of goods. So GiveWell top charities are the gold standard. These are really, really good charities. They're 10 or 15 times better than cash. These are incredible charities doing incredible work. But they do mostly focus on, they directly do the thing. They go out and give people vitamin A supplements. They go out and give people bed nets. They go out and do the malaria seasonal chemo prevention, or they give mothers cash if you get your child vaccinated. So they are directly providing the service. But when we think about careers in EA, we rarely think that direct provision of good is the most impactful thing you could do. I believe AEK even has a whole website on how being a doctor is not necessarily the most good you could do. You might want to choose something leveraged where you can influence how other doctors make decisions. So impactful careers are often focused on directing more resources than one individual person could muster. So maybe we should be thinking about charities in the same way, thinking about directing other resources besides our own. So we're thinking instead about global public health instead of just global health. Historically, this kind of makes sense. That's what rich countries do. People in Washington, D.C. are not waiting for AMF to distribute them some bed nets, even though Washington, D.C. has historically very much had a malaria problem. Instead, the U.S. made policy choices that eliminated malaria in its incredibly swampy, incredibly miserable in the summer capital. So they made policy choices rather than focusing on direct delivery. Policy is inherently leveraged. For a fixed cost of passing a policy will apply to many more people than were involved in its passage. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not quite that simple. Lobbying can be really costly. Particularly in rich countries, lobbying can be more costly than just providing the service itself. Lobbying for changes in housing policy might be more costly than just building small homes for homeless people. Certainly there are homelessness charities that think it is. Please note, I don't work on land use reform. That is not that is not a data-driven statement, simply that lobbying can be very costly in rich countries. And not all policy is followed, particularly in the countries where GiveWell top charities tend to be. The state is often quite weak. So whether the state says you can't do this or you should do this, are people going to follow that? Because even in rich countries with high state capacity, many people disobey traffic laws all the time. Everyone gets speeding tickets pretty much. And then in countries where you have even less state capacity, the laws that are not followed are things like corruption. There are a lot of ways that policy cannot actually influence how people behave. So when do we think policy is a really good intervention? When we think the costs are low and the benefits are high. So the costs tend to be lower when they're extending existing policies. So creating a new government department would be really hard. But if there's already a thing regulating something and you just need to change it so that it does something very slightly different or extends it, or like you're changing a tax from 17% to 19%. If you're already collecting 17%, it's not a huge deal to collect 19% instead. If you're working on non-contentious issues, so things that are like deeply controversial in a country tend to have more money spent on them. They're going to involve more lobbying to try to get voices heard, and it's much less likely to make a difference because people already have set opinions. And then if you're working in a place where things are cheap, so an average government bureaucrat in Nigeria might make $15,000. Even a high-ranking government bureaucrat in Nigeria might make $30,000. A high-ranking U.S. official makes $150,000 to just under $200,000. So you can see that, like, trying to change policy in the U.S., where you're going to have to pay lobbyists $100,000 to $200,000 a year, is going to be way more expensive than trying to change policy in Nigeria, where you are paying your lobbyists $15,000 or $30,000. So when else is it a good intervention? The benefits are large. So when the population affected is large. So I'm largely going to talk about big countries. So Nigeria is going to come up again because there are a lot of people in Nigeria. You mostly are probably not going to look at policy interventions in, say, Mongolia. I may talk about Mongolia when I talk about alcohol in a few minutes, but there are only 3 million people in Mongolia. If you can pass the same policy for the same cost in Nigeria, even if it's less effective, you're going to do more good. The policy change will be implemented effectively. So that may be a country with high state capacity. It may be something that the state is particularly good at implementing. It could be both. And the per person benefit is large. So a policy intervention that's very popular in EA circles right now is working on removing lead from things, because the per person benefit of not, say, consuming lead in spices is very large. So why taxes for this talk? Governments already collect taxes, so you don't have to, like, get the government to start doing a thing that it's not already doing. You need to continue doing the thing it already is doing. And tweaking the tax code is common. Many of you will have seen, like, news stories about changes in the tax code, or new tax breaks, or new taxes on the rich, or changes in tax brackets depending on inflation. That those are really common changes. So it's similarly relatively common and relatively easy to try to change tax codes for other reasons as well. You're not starting from scratch. Like, in general, there are some taxes on almost anything already. So you might be changing the amount, but you're not being like, this thing, we're going to start from scratch. We're going to do a completely new thing that no one has ever done before. Also, people think it's stultifyingly dull. Like, there is some industry pushback about, say, changing the tax rate on alcohol from 10% to 12%. But the average person who goes and votes is probably not going to get that worked up about that. They're not going to, like, you're not going to, like, change the democracy of a country or worry about anti-democratic measures if you're talking about things that a lot of people, like, don't care that deeply about, that it's not contentious generally. And taxes can have big effects. People operate in an environment of scarcity. Like, most people do not have as much money as they would like to spend, so they are making choices about what they can and can't spend money on. Like, I live in London. I would like to live in a house. I live in a 45 square meter apartment because, like, I am not, in fact, made of money. Taxes cover a lot of issues. So what jobs people do and what businesses succeed, because many businesses have some kind of tax credits, and the kinds of jobs people accept are dependent on how the tax code works. Where and what buildings are built? What are the taxes on those buildings? Where are they building those buildings? Is property tax lower or higher in a particular place? What energy sources we use? So are we using solar and wind, or are we building more fossil fuel plants? And then consumption choices, like how much sugar, alcohol, tobacco we consume. So some examples of how taxes change behavior. So governments often lower taxes in regions where they want to have more economic activity. China famously did this in its special economic zones, and that might have been partially responsible for the takeoff of Shenzhen. Shenzhen is one of the great development success stories of the last half century. In 1970, it had a GDP per capita of $100 a year, and now it has a GDP per capita of $30,000 a year. So that is a development win. So if income taxes are lower for people who get married, more people get married. There are papers showing that when income taxes are preferentially lower for people who are married, more people get married. And people even manage to somehow delay their deaths to avoid estate taxes. When it was an estate tax reform, there were fewer deaths right before so that they could avoid taxes. They managed to hang on just a little bit longer so that their estate would be less taxed. This won an Ig Nobel Prize. You can look it up. It's a great paper. So let's get to some examples. So in public health, I said I was going to talk about alcohol, and I'm going to talk about alcohol. I am personally very, very excited about alcohol taxation as a possible cause area for EAs. About 1 in 30 disability-adjusted life years lost worldwide is due to alcohol consumption. That's a lot of life years. And for every 1-ish% that the price of alcohol increases, consumption decreases about 0.5%. So the developed world has largely responded to that. So taxes on alcohol are quite high. In the UK, where I live, about 50% of the purchase price is taxes. But they can be quite low in the developing world. In some countries, they can be between 0 and 10%. And unsurprisingly, people consume more because it's quite cheap. But increasing taxation decreases the amount that people drink and decreases the health consequences of alcohol. I should note that the health consequences of alcohol are largely not from I like to have a glass of wine at dinner. They are mostly from I like to have 7 or 10 glasses of wine at dinner. So Russia is the primary example here. A known stereotype about Russia is that it's a hard drinking culture. Since 2003, though, they have increased the cost of alcohol and the difficulty to buy alcohol, decreasing sale hours. You can no longer buy alcohol in the middle of the night, and ratcheting up the cost of alcohol every single year. Since then, alcohol sales and amount consumed has dropped 43%, and all-cause mortality in Russia has dropped 38%. Not all of that is due to alcohol, but quite a lot of it is. Russia's high alcohol consumption was part of the reason that it had a much lower male life expectancy than anywhere else in Europe, because alcohol consumption was, I don't remember what it was off the top of my head, but I want to say it was 4 to 5 times what the WHO recommends as a maximum. So if we take our previous example, that for every 1% the price of alcohol increases, consumption decreases 0.5%. Increasing the price of alcohol in Nigeria by about 2% could save about 16,000 lives a year. And that's a pretty minor change, while alcohol manufacturers are likely to care a lot about it. For most people that consume alcohol, because they enjoy alcohol, a 2% price increase will not prevent them from ever drinking. It will not prevent them from going out with their friends or having a glass of wine at dinner or anything like that. That these are nudges more than the government forcing you to do anything, which is one of the other reasons that I think taxation is an interesting tool to use, in that it is not forcing anyone to do anything. So sin taxes, these taxes on things that the government would rather you not consume, are pretty common. So cigarettes are more expensive than they were in the 1980s. In the UK, They are 10 times as expensive as they were in 1980. And 67% of that purchase price is now taxes. This is actually slightly less than the WHO recommends. They recommend a 75% tax on tobacco because for about every 1% the price of tobacco increases, the consumption of tobacco decreases by about 0.65%. So fewer people die of lung cancer the more expensive you make tobacco. Similarly, consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages drops about 1% for every 1% the price increases. And this is true even for really addictive substances like cigarettes and alcohol. Like one might think that this is just like light consumers, someone who like smokes a cigarette occasionally when they're drunk, or people that don't really care that much about drinking, so like it's fine, like I'll pass on it if it's that expensive. But it seems to be that even heavy consumers respond to these, and that's where these health benefits come from. So, beyond public health, what else can you do with taxes? Well, you can regulate energy. It's widely known that green energy sources have some kind of tax credit associated with them. For instance, electric cars are tax advantaged in the UK. So that made companies continue to invest in these sources when they were not yet cost effective. So if you look at this chart, like solar was not particularly cost effective with fossil fuels in 1991, but by 2013, it was starting to be very cost effective. And those tax credits helped continue investment until it reached a scale and companies had driven down prices so it could be cost competitive. Hilariously, green energy is now so cheap that fossil fuel companies are demanding tax incentives to subsidize their cost. So in Texas this year, they introduced a new bill that would make only clean energy projects pay for taxes that would pay for new infrastructure to connect, to improve the Texas grid, to connect to the grid, etc. This thankfully failed, but you can see how different groups are using fiscal policy to try to encourage the use of different types of energy sources. In this case, if we want a green energy transition, we want to not directly subsidize fossil fuel companies. So city planning. And I've gotten a few messages about this, about whether I would be talking about a land value tax. And yes, I will be talking about a land value tax. So land value tax is a tax only on the value of the land. It's hard to avoid because you have the land. If you have proof of ownership of the land, which you generally do to build on it, it's difficult to avoid. You also don't prevent production of more of the thing. Generally, if you tax something, it makes it less profitable to produce, so people produce less of it. They're not making more land, so this is not really a problem for land taxation. It also prevents some NIMBYism, high value land, high taxes. You need more development to help defray those costs of taxes that you're going to have to pay anyway. So if you have this valuable land, you're going to develop it. But there are other tax interventions and interventions that have tax implications that aren't like directly tax related. For instance, some cities in Ethiopia planned expansions rather than sort of just letting the city grow on its own. So they put in more arterial roads and tried to plan out blocks instead of just having people build whatever seemed feasible at the time. It increased the likelihood of people having formal title to their land. And because people have formal title, that means that the government knows what they own and can appropriately assess taxes. It also increased the likelihood that they are connected to city water because you can prove that you own it and want to connect to city water. So the increased tax revenue from planning the city as opposed to just letting people build as they wanted far exceeded the cost to plan and build these arterial roads. And my last example, tax enforcement. So we've been talking a lot about like taxes. They're good. They can prevent people from doing bad things. They can get people to do good things. But they also, like, the government does something with those taxes that they collect. When Ethiopia collects more taxes, they can improve their schools, which are not currently that great. They can spend more on health because they currently don't spend all that much on health because it's a low-income country with a relatively low tax base. They just don't have the money to spend on health. So there's about $1 trillion of illicit financial flows per year. These are not just tax avoidance, but like tax fraud, where you are trying to get money out of a country without it being taxed at all. Philanthropists only spend about $20 million a year trying to prevent these illicit financial flows. And in the US, at least, every $1 spent on audits returns at least 2 times the amount that is spent on them. And as you go up in income, it's more. So for like the top 1%, it's 3 times the amount. For the top 0.1%, I believe it's 4 times the amount. And that's in the US, where tax compliance is pretty decent. In countries where tax compliance is much more, let's go with optional, you could do even more good with like people actually paying the taxes that they should. So I worked in Uganda for a bit, and like it was just a flat joke among my Ugandan colleagues that they would ever pay income tax because the government was never going to make them. But that also meant that the Ugandan government couldn't pay the police very well, couldn't like pay healthcare workers very well, etc. So if you, let's say you could get some of that 1 trillion, well, current global spending on malaria is only 0.2% of 1 trillion. Imagine what governments could do with an extra 1 trillion. Even if you think that governments are relatively inefficient spenders, we think that the spending of particularly countries that are having illicit money flow out of them, it's generally common for it to go from poor and middle income countries to rich countries. Wealthy people in middle income countries want to buy their cough cough Russian oligarch houses in West London or in New York or in Miami. So country governments where there are still very, very high returns to government spending are losing income that they desperately need. Taxes, they're good for things. You can do good things with them. So these are just a few examples. I'm going to leave most of the time for Q&A. This is not a comprehensive list of the things that you can do with taxes or a comprehensive list of the ways that EAs should think about like tax reform. These are just kind of a few starting ideas. You might think about like increasing taxes through a charity that lobbies for them. You might think about changing the tax structure so it's more efficient by working for a government. There are a lot of different ways that you can influence tax. This is basically a like tax. It's cool. It's not as boring as people say it is. So with that, questions from the room. And also, if you have questions later, feel free to email me. I'm Lauren@openphilanthropy.org.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lauren. We have a lot of questions here, and the first one would be from Noah. Do you see subsidy reform as being as impactful as tax policy and potentially more politically tractable in certain sectors?
Yes, I do. It depends on the sector, it depends on the country, how tractable subsidy reform can be. Famously, ag subsidies in both the EU and the US are not incredibly well designed and also very hard to change. But subsidies in some other sectors can be easier to change. And it does the same thing of like increasing incentives to do good things, decreasing the incentives to do bad things. And if you're increasing the amount of money that the government takes in or decreasing the amount of money that the government spends, presumably you think the government is doing something useful with that money. Or if you are trying to like produce more of a certain activity, you think that it is more useful to produce more of that activity and the government should be spending money on it. So for instance, you might subsidize research and development because you think that innovation leads to higher growth.
Another question that's more, I guess, hypothetical. If drug legalization is better than the war on drugs, does it make sense to then have heavy taxes on the drugs?
I'm going to pass on that question. I am not particularly a drug policy expert. I don't have strong thoughts on whether or not drugs should be legalized and if they should be taxed.
Another question from Anelli. There have been already an attempts at improving health outcomes through food taxes, but these measures face public rejection. How likely are tobacco or alcohol taxes to succeed if faced with public backlash?
So that's a thing that we take into account in our grant making. We don't think that, we think that people enjoy drinking alcohol. And cigarette smokers, I don't necessarily enjoy smoking, but like addiction is a thing. And some cigarette smokers do actually enjoy smoking cigarettes. We expect less opposition than for food taxes because there is like a normal human diet includes some amount of sugar. It probably includes 0 cigarettes. So a larger percentage of the population is likely to be affected by a food tax than a cigarette or alcohol tax. We also think that it is important to not be incredibly heavy-handed on this. Like we are not suggesting that we should go back to prohibition. In case the accent wasn't a clue, I'm American. That didn't work all that well. Hot take, prohibition did not prevent the consumption of alcohol in the United States. However, a 2% increase in the price of alcohol, or even a 10% increase in the price of alcohol, seems much more likely to be successful and less coercive on the population. It will change each individual's habits a small amount and make a larger difference on the population level. That being said, yes, there will be opposition. That is true.
Thank you, Lauren. Here's a question from Rebecca. Taxes require complex logistics and operations management that can be highly expensive and infeasible in many low-income countries. There are huge benefits, as you mentioned, to figuring out how to get taxes right. How do you balance the long-term benefits of establishing a well-functioning tax system with addressing immediate needs flowing in from foreign aid?
The answer is that is largely up to the government itself on how much they want to spend on their tax system versus, and it's also somewhat of an endogenous process. Certainly tax evasion in most currently rich countries used to be much higher when they were less developed than they are now. So the answer is it's complicated. It probably needs, that is not a decision that philanthropists should make. That is probably a political economy decision that should be made by the countries themselves.
Question from Emily. Are there certain issues where direct service provision is expected to be more cost-effective versus others where tax policy would be? Or do you expect tax or fiscal policy to be almost always more cost-effective? If the latter, why do you think EA hasn't historically paid much attention to it?
I think there are things that fiscal policy is not particularly well suited to addressing. So I brought up malaria early on. Can't really tax mosquitoes very well. There's not really a malaria tax that you can apply that is going to make malaria go away. There are things governments can do to reduce malaria, but there is no fiscal policy solution to that. So yes, there are some things that are just not addressable through fiscal policy. Also, GiveWell in particular, and I think Ellie and Holden would agree with this, was built on high evidence interventions. So we are very certain that if you give someone a vitamin A supplement, they will no longer be vitamin A deficient. That is less true with tax policy reform. With any kind of policy reform, it's hard to tell how much of a difference you made. It's hard to tell if it was going to happen anyway. The counterfactuals are much more difficult. So EA, particularly Global Health EA, largely started as what are things we can do that we are absolutely certain are good and high impact. And as EA has matured, there's been more interest in these high risk, high reward kinds of interventions.
Thank you. There's a question from Tris. There is an inherent tension between increasing taxes to reduce undesired behavior and using taxes to raise revenue. That is the most successful a tax is at reducing consumption, the less money it raises for the government. Do you worry that this could create a perverse incentive for politicians? If so, how might this be managed?
Yeah, I think that's true. That it depends on what the point of the tax is. Many sin taxes, like the point is not necessarily to raise revenue. Cigarette taxes are not as high as they are in the UK because the UK is relying on taxes from cigarettes to like fund the military. That's like it's not a huge part of the UK budget. However, if it was a big part of the UK budget, you could see like wanting people to still consume tobacco in order to keep the UK economy functioning. A famous historical example of this is that at the outbreak of World War I, about a third of the Russian state budget was funded by alcohol taxes. Nicholas II then promptly banned all alcohol. And suddenly the government had no money with which to fight World War I. So there he made a public health choice that, like, well, A, didn't work very well, and B, crippled his government and was not responsible for the Bolsheviks, but it was likely a small contributing factor. And then his own assassination and the end of the Tsarist regime. So it is important to not base the functioning of your government on things that you would rather people not do.
See, Emily also has another questions. Are you concerned about the argument that consumption taxes are regressive, like from a moral concern or a public backlash concern?
Absolutely. I think that EA is and should be concerned with the well-being of those that are like least able to deal with changes. I think that things like tobacco are, I think, somewhat less. I'm less concerned about that because most or many people that do use tobacco would rather not. Many people try to quit and fail. Similarly with alcohol, many people would like to drink less than they do. I am particularly concerned with many food taxes because I think they are likely to fall on those that have like the least ability to deal with them. And like, I don't know, seems reasonable to me that sometimes you want like I did just endorse sugar sweetened beverages taxes while drinking a San Pellegrino. So we should be aware of what the impact on people is. And if there is public pushback, that is information that we should take very seriously. Like EAs are largely from rich countries that are not making the kind of like, how do I get by the day decisions that many people in poor countries are making. We should take the feedback of people who are making decisions under conditions that we don't live in very, very seriously.
Thank you. I see there's some more questions about LMICs coming up. Illicit financial flows seem like a big problem in high-income countries as well. And high-income countries seem to enable some of these flows out of low-income countries as well. Have you looked into that kind of policy that
We have.
high-income countries can implement? And does this seem more or less tractable than working in LMIC?
We have. This is a ongoing investigation within OpenPhil. I think views vary on where you should focus your energy. A journalist who has written a lot about things that high-income countries, particularly the UK, could do to decrease illicit financial flows is Oliver Bullock. He's written a couple very excellent books on it that I highly recommend.
Woody asked a question, are there any examples of efforts to increase tax compliance through a campaign to push rich people and corporations to release more of their tax return or else face some social consequences, such as like requiring Academy Award nominees to have some accounting firms review their taxes if they want to win an award?
I don't know offhand. I do know that some Scandinavian countries, Norway, I believe, have public tax returns. So you can, like, everyone's tax return is viewable, but you can see who has viewed your tax return. So there is like there's some nominal fee associated with it. So like newspapers regularly publish things about like the highest taxpayers in Norway. I don't entirely know how a country like the US or the UK transitions to an equilibrium like that.
Brown Color asked, do taxes on wine provoke political resistance and lobbying against by wine producers?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Do taxes on wine provoke political resistance and lobbying against by the wine producers?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There are a couple examples of this in low-income countries, even not from wine producers, but from beer producers. That there's a big beer bottling plant in a particular country that tried to increase alcohol taxes, and there was major backlash, and the tax had to be removed. I think that there are ways that you could make a tax more resilient to that. That, for instance, in that case, there was very little discussion about the public health consequences of alcohol. It was largely perceived as like a revenue-raising measure rather than a public health measure. But yeah, like we expect industry pushback. We expect more industry pushback from alcohol than tobacco because, frankly, everyone knows cigarettes are bad for you. And there is some discomfort with alcohol taxation because many people enjoy alcohol in moderation. And for most of those people, it's not particularly a health issue or something that they should even be concerned about. However, there is some percentage of alcohol users that will face health consequences, and they are largely not the people having one glass of wine with dinner.
JT Stanley asked, how will open philanthropy further explore this space and potentially invest in it?
OpenPhil does plan to continue exploring the space. That's about all I can say.
Amazing. Sam also asked, do you have any thoughts on the use of UN versus OECD model tax treaties?
No, I don't.
And have a question on whether there are interventions on taxes on certain products, like whether taxes on certain products affects people from certain social groups disproportionately.
Yes.
They assume that tobacco or sweetened drinks taxes affect relatively poor people stronger than rich ones, for example.
Yes, that is true. This is actually one of the reasons that I quite like alcohol taxation, because alcohol consumption rises with income rather than falling with income. So relatively wealthy people drink more alcohol than relatively poor people. And therefore, like, I feel better about taxing relatively rich people. They have more money to it that can be spent on taxes. Um, like, you have to continuously balance what is reasonable for a particular person and a particular group to bear with what what is good public health policy and what is good fiscal policy. So generally, we're talking about pretty marginal changes. So many of you will live in countries with sugar sweetened beverages taxes. They are taxes, they do exist, but they are 5-10%. They're like, they add a dime to the price of a sugar sweetened beverage. This concerns me somewhat less than if we were talking about, actually, you know what, you know, poor people should not be having hot food, for instance, and therefore they shouldn't be able to pay for that. For those that don't recognize the thing that I'm clearly referencing, food stamps in the US, SNAP, does not allow you to purchase prepared food on food stamps. And so I am a little bit less concerned about coercion with increasing taxes a small amount than I am things like, sometimes poor people are very tired and don't have time to cook dinner and would like to just buy some prepared food.
Thank you. Tristan asked, do you have a feeling of for how effective changing opinions on taxes in high-income countries where opinions on taxes writ large are becoming partisan, i.e. Republicans in the US and their IRS?
I don't have a strong sense. I will say that the partisanship of taxes seems to be malleable, that for a long time, Democrats have been the party of higher taxes and also the party of lower earners. However, with increasing educational polarization, it is now becoming more common for high income people to be Democrats, even though it would increase their own taxes. So it's complicated. Political polarization, it's complicated. This is what I learned in grad school in political science.
Thank you. Adebayo asked, what is the cost effectiveness of more tax, as in payment theory, of taking to cognizant of government ineptitude spending of same?
Can you repeat the question?
What is the cost effectiveness of more tax or payment theory of taking to cognizant government ineptitude spending of the same?
So I think that it's easy to be very skeptical about the effectiveness of government spending in a rich country. That the marginal dollar that the US government or the UK government collects is frankly not that effective. However, low-income country governments often have much tighter fiscal binds that Uganda, for instance, spends, I believe, $31 per year per person on health. And that might actually be an overestimate. I'm trying to remember what the number is off the top of my head. Going from $31 to $40 means you can provide people a lot more. That even if the government is like pretty bad at providing things, the amount that is currently provided is so low that you can make, like, the cost effectiveness can still be reasonable, even if the government's like kind of bad at their job.
Woody has a question. What do you think of taxes on companies that indirectly facilitate crime, i.e., gun manufacturers, social networks that amplify trash talking that lead to gang violence, cars with design flaws that make them too easy to be stolen?
I haven't really thought about it, so I don't know that I have an answer.
For now, there's no questions in the question tab yet. Maybe Lauren, you can share more about what's the plan is at Open Philanthropy and like what is your upcoming projects or reports that you're hoping to look into.
Yes, so we're hoping to publish our report on alcohol consumption and alcohol taxation in the near future. So there will be, that was written by me. You will have many, many more of my thoughts on alcohol taxes. So if you have any questions on them, hopefully they will be answered in the like 10,000 words I have written about them. We are also continuing to pursue grant making in global public health. Some of that may be fiscal policy related, some of it may be other sorts of policy interventions that improve public health, because we think that there may be very cost-effective interventions there.
You clarify on how your reports will contribute to the grant making at Open Philanthropy.
So our general process is that we do a shallow investigation, which is about 3 weeks. We go on to a medium investigation, which is about 3 months. And then at that point, we will decide if we hire a grant maker in that area. Often, after a promising shallow investigation, like this alcohol report that we will be publishing, we may make some grants in the area. We have also done a medium investigation on global public health, and are like generally optimistic about public health as a cause area in general, and we will likely be making substantial grants in the area.
Awesome. I'm so excited for it. Do you have any tips or resources for people who are hoping to do this kind of research?
So my worst best tip is, unfortunately, grad school is really useful. Don't pay for grad school. Don't ever pay for grad school. Like try to get something that's on a stipend, but being able, like, technical expertise so that you can read papers in public health, even if you don't know anything about the topic, is and econ and political science is very useful. That I knew absolutely nothing about alcohol when I started that investigation, but I had enough background in social science to be like, okay, so the elasticity of consumption relative to price increases is X. Otherwise, there are a lot of impactful jobs that you can do within governments. I got a question before this talk about, like, should you think about this as a career you can do through charity, or whether you should work in a government? And the answer is, depends on which you personally want to do. But I think there are a lot of impactful ways that you could work on this at the World Health Organization, or your country government, or at a charity. For instance, there have been a couple. There's been a alcohol taxation related charity founded by a charity entrepreneurship graduate. So there are a lot of different ways to do impactful work on tax.
Thank you, Lauren. I think we have time for one more question from Sarah. Do you remember how you came to first think seriously about tax policy as a promising intervention, either by yourself or Open Phil as an org?
So by myself, I'm a physicist by training. So basically anything that will let me do numbers at it, I am thrilled to do. So like tax policy is a little bit obvious. Is that like, yes, I can numbers things. Open Phil has been thinking more deeply about this, because in the same way that GiveWell has, in that, like, are there leveraged ways that we can influence public health?
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for a lot of insightful and loaded questions. I hope you've had a great session learning more about tax policy for good. If you have more questions, Lauren has an office hour right after those. Remember to join that, or if not, you can just email Lauren or book a one-on-one with her during the conference. Thank you so much for your participation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, everyone.